Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final day of the Africa Summit. This is day 4, and it's been amazing. It's been an absolutely fantastic week, full of discussions and debates and learning and thinking. So thank you so much, all of you, for engaging with us. I'm Ksenia Chmutin, I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies. And today we are closing the Africa Summit with the day on vibrant and inclusive communities. Justice, equity, inclusion have been the topics that really came up, I think, from the very launch of the summit on Monday, and somehow have been propping up all the way through, regardless of what topic we've been discussing. So it's absolutely fantastic that today we have an opportunity to kind of really dig into this a little bit more. It's a hybrid event. Just a reminder, as always, we are recording this event, and the keynote will be published on our YouTube channel and as a podcast next week. For those of you online, if you have any questions for the keynote or later for the panel discussion, please post those in Q&A section on Zoom. We are monitoring that. And I think that's all the house rules I need to say. Sorry, looking at Kieran here. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome our IS fellow, our summit fellow, Professor Cheryl Potgieter, to join us today and to present her keynote. Cheryl heads the Gender, Justice, Health, and Human Development and Research and Doctoral Leadership Academy at Durban University of Technology. I've had the privilege of working with Cheryl for the last 5 years, I think, right? And I'm absolutely delighted that we're able to host Cheryl today as our fellow at the IAS. Cheryl, over to you for a keynote.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Ksenia. I would also just like to take this opportunity for you having invited me, and I'd also like to thank your staff for all the support that they've given me in getting here. And also, I'd also like to thank the African envoys who were on a short meeting with me, Iba and Sola, for your support. And the week has been amazing, and I look forward to sharing some of my thoughts with you this morning. I was proposed or given in a good way this topic entitled Building Vibrant and Inclusive Cities, the Role of Inclusion in Sustainable Development. So I'm a psychologist by training. I have a doctorate in psychology, and I work across the humanities. I work very interdisciplinary. So when I was given this topic, I was like, okay, when I was, the short topic was shared with me and I was asked to talk to it, I actually wrote an email because I was wondering, is this a topic that I am in a space to talk about? And what my concern was, and I'm very confident on what I can do and what I can't do, so it's not from a space of apology. I thought maybe I had not worked enough or in a space that was the area of cities. And then I stepped back and I said to myself, does my work contribute to creating vibrant, inclusive cities? And what work of mine over my career in the last also 5-10 years contributes to building inclusive cities, even though my work might not say I'm working in building an inclusive city. I'm a psychologist and I work in gender studies. And then I stepped a little further back and said, is the work that I've done and on gender-based violence, the work that I've done and continue to want to start doing again on gender and transport, the work that has been my life's work on LGBTQI+, which you've heard I've spoken a lot about in the 2 or 3 days that I've been here, and my work on sport and homophobia. Surely that work contributes to inclusive, vibrant cities. And I thought, Yes, it's inclusive. It's interesting how our disciplinary discourses also sort of lock us in terms of our thinking space. So in the project that Ksenia and I got to know each other, which was a GRIP project, which was it was resilience in policy and practice, gender resilience in practice. We actually did a publication asking what is the feminist city. So from where I come, the city has always, in my earliest memories, been one of where I and my family have been excluded. I will share the article that I wrote on the feminist city. I mentioned it very briefly in the first day that I was here, because my family were forcibly removed from a particular area in South Africa. My grandmother and mother and family, I mean, I was like a baby. And it was because we were not classified white, and we had to, the homes that we had were taken away. It wasn't only a forced removal in the sense of you need to move. The land was taken away. There's been redress many years later, but the redress is, we can question that as well. So inclusive cities has always been a sort of psychological, emotional challenge for me. And it has intergenerational impact on my family. And my family, I'm just using it as a case study, it has intergenerational impact on many Black people in South Africa. Is what I do not is it not creating a vibrant city? And then as I said earlier, the answer is yes. And then I had to think, what do I share with you here today? Of course, I've got empirical evidence that I can share with you in my work, but I've chosen to take another route in my engagement with you here this morning in talking about vibrant, inclusive cities. So let me just go back and just underpin what my thinking is. So inclusion in the literature, as we all know, is used interchangeably with the discourse of social cohesion. And for me, it creates an imaginary and also a policy imagination goal in society. It's an imaginary, but it's also a policy imagination, and it has to have an end. And so social cohesion represents a vision for a society for all. It's inclusive, in which every individual, each with rights and responsibilities, has an active role to play. And I by choice chose a very old report to show that these terms have been around for a long time, and how it's, if I do another talk, one can also look at how it has been included in the discourse and how the terms have been used interchangeably, and how governments have also used it. I was appointed a few years ago by one of our government premiers as one of 2 or 3 people, commissioners, and we were part of a commission, a government commission in the province of KwaZulu-Natal in KZN, where we looked at how does one bring about social cohesion in the province. After that, I was also part of a commission, when it was also linked, of course, to try to build inclusive cities, where we looked at political killings in KZN, and it was called the Murani Commission, and the reports are public. As a universal goal, I think social cohesion, inclusion, aims to achieve an inclusive society that entails respect for human rights, cultural diversity, and democratic governance, and upholds principles of equality and equity. Sometimes I just think we need to bring ourselves back to the space of what is underpinning the actual work that we are doing. The position I hold is that it is unlikely that development will be sustainable unless it is inclusive. So there's a book which looks at the South Africa experience, building on or underpinned, or they use Frantz Fanon's theory to underpin their engagement. So I've just taken this out of it. So the new African city must be designed for its specific social dimensions and space, structured from a new vision that takes into account considerations, for instance, the importance of agricultural production within the cities, the special integration of all the city's function, and the reduced interest of the CBD concept, and it's taken form from of course, the American and European city. Now, I'm not arguing, and I don't think they are arguing, and Sola also mentioned it yesterday, that he's not arguing against the CBD or the city when he was talking about rural areas. But I think what I'm trying to get to you is the essence of an African city. And it's sort of based on Fanonian principles. Creating, I've taken from a newspaper, because I like to use different reference points when I engage. So South Africa has August as Women's Month. And Women's Month in South Africa is in August because in 1956, women marched to the union buildings, our head of government, to challenge the apartheid system at that stage. So this grouping of women in South Africa, in Cape Town, and they are architects. And they have put this organization together to focus on women's holding the space as architects, and also their argument that who designs cities is really, really important. So this came from the newspaper, and they spoke about greater representation of women in the built environment industry has links to sustainability. It's important to note that buildings contribute to about 40% of global energy consumption and about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emission, figures that are predicted to continue increasing. Many of you work in these areas, so this is not new information to you. I'm not going to, when it comes to thinking about sustainable design and creating sustainable cities, one of the important steps towards this is getting more women into positions of power in the industry. Women tend to be more concerned about issues of sustainability and willing to fight for them. That is a direct quote from Jade, who is an architect in South Africa. And the moral of the story that a woman architect has also stated is that if we want to create more inclusive, thriving, sustainable cities, we need the people who design them to reflect the lived experience of the people that live in them. Indigenous solutions. That word has come up in the last 3 or 4 days over here. And this is from a South African newspaper article in 2022 in Women's Month. So I could talk to you or choose to talk to you about many ways of how one should theoretically, practically, and in terms of policy and interventions, create an inclusive, vibrant city, and an inclusive, vibrant African city. I've decided to draw on work or areas that I've worked in the last couple of years. So I've worked in the area of gender development and transport. So I'm going to look at how one needs to focus on the issue of gender and development transport in creating vibrant and inclusive spaces. And of course, I will talk to you about the challenges and then move to the other space. Then I'm going to also talk about how does one deal with the issue of including the LGBTQI+ community in building vibrant African cities, when the majority of African governments have and are transgressing on the issue of human rights in terms of the LGBTQI+ community. I also ask, is policy enough? South Africa, we have one of the best policy environments in the world in terms of gender justice and also in terms of the LGBTIQ community, but we have a lot of problems and challenges. There's good news stories, but of course there are challenges. And I'm going to use some real world examples, not to be sensationalist, but to locate my examples in the real world. Gender and transport. It's important in creating vibrant cities for women. So my interest, and I think I also mentioned very early when I started here on Monday, that when one does work, the personal is political, is professional. So my interest in gender and transport emerged out of the fact that I've always worked in the area of gender justice. But a few years ago, I was the humanities representative on our National Road Agency board, which is the South African National Road Agency Limited. It's SANRAL, and I worked with engineers, and they build roads, national roads, and disperse funds to regional and local government in the country. So, that space interested me in working in gender and transport, and I also sourced funding, and I did a big conference, an African conference on gender and transport. So the UN Commission has in recent years found there's a gender bias in transport planning and failure to address gender in the system of configuration. That's the language they use. In South Africa, for example, buses travel from the townships where women, and specifically Black poor women, live to the CBD. So the Black poor women, a number of them are domestic workers. Where do the domestic workers work? In the suburbs. But the buses run from the townships to the CBD, and then these women need to find taxis and other modes of transport to get to work in the middle class houses in the suburbs. So transport planning routes are a challenge. Who does those transport planning routes? Not necessarily women, men, and not necessarily men with a development or a gender focus. So that's a challenge. So when we look also in times when buses run, times when men go to work is when the buses run. So it will be 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning, and then the buses are going to these spaces where working class men, and let me say again, working class Black men are working and find they need the transport. But the women, remember, many are domestic workers, but also women are wanting to take their children to, let's say, the health clinic during the day. Then the buses have stopped, or it doesn't go to the route where the clinic is, or they must collect their children from school. Scholar transport is a big issue in South Africa, and I think in some other countries in Africa as well. It's dangerous and there's a lot of challenges. So again, the planning and the times, it's not gender sensitive. So women are excluded. Way in which buses are designed. It's getting a bit better, but we still have the problem. I asked a woman the other day, a random woman on the street, do you ever use the bus? And she said, yes. And she had this pram. I said, how do you manage? She said, oh, it's so difficult and it doesn't fold up and the stairs are so narrow. The ways in which buses are designed, women can't, for example, bring in prams. So the issue of design in gender and development and inclusivity is also important. When we think about buildings, in catering, who works in catering? Women. Where are the kitchens in a number of the buildings in the CBD? On the second and the third floor. Are there lifts in all the buildings? What part of no don't we understand? Bus transport is often cut. When there has to be budgetary cuts, we've noticed that the most common transport of women, for mode of women, is buses and what we know as taxis, but very often is cut. So in South Africa, taxis control our economy. There'd be chaos in Johannesburg on certain days, and the economy comes to a standstill when the taxis protest against government challenges. So the taxi industry in South Africa is something else. I cannot take 5 minutes to explain it to you. These blind spots mean that the city is not inclusive of women's needs. And let me also be, it's not inclusive of Black working class women's needs. Not all white women are rich, but the majority are Black women and working class women. What has changed and what has stayed the same? So many years ago, like it's almost like 1918, I did this research and it was published, Women Development and Transport in Rural Eastern Cape, South Africa. I would like to go back and do a similar study again with partners because much has changed and much has stayed the same. So let me share with you what happened out there. So gender development and transport. So this research was done in the deep rural area of Eastern Cape, South Africa. And we had to walk into the deep hills and rural areas to access the participants. The monograph, and I think if I do it again today, I'm not going to get any much different information because we still work in those communities. This monograph addressed the challenges facing policy and its implementation in respect of women development and transport by concentrating on selected sites in the rural Eastern Cape province of South Africa. A key indicator in social, political, and economic development, as I think I've tried to say, transport is not simply about mobility and infrastructure, but it's also about social, cultural roles and responsibilities that impede the development of women and girl children. The study provided an original perspective via established methodologies and we used time-use diaries on the important social, economic, and cultural barriers that confirm women's negative experiences as effects of patriarchal power. Insights gained in the research were directed towards the Eastern Cape government, but also we took note of the issue of poverty alleviation, gender mainstreaming, and intervention in respect of violence against women, which was a direct experience of the transport and travel-related activities of these women. And the empirical evidence was reinforced by recommendations to provide valuable input to national policy and planning. So the one thing that I can say to you, women here, so let me catch up on where we were in terms of transport and gender and the burnt toast. Okay, so the gender development and transport, this research, what we actually found as well was that women, their mode of transport in these deep rural areas is their two legs, is walking and head loading. That is how you get by, and you have to walk long distances to the river. And what was also happening in those areas was that there was lots of gender-based violence and women were attacked and raped when they were going to the river by men from not only in the community, but of course also people coming in. So, it was those challenges, but we also found that girl children, and it's still the same, the time that they spend, we did the time diaries, that men and women and girl children and boy children spending what they're doing during the day. The girl children have to cook in the afternoon, fetch water, so they are time poor. And it impacts, of course, on their schoolwork. And the women are time poor because they have to the washing, the cleaning, the caring for the men. But the interesting thing is that women in these spaces, they challenged the gendered notions of the men. The men would sit around and they would have a car and a cell phone, and we also did workshops, and they would have all the modern technology, and they would say, so why aren't you going to fetch water? And they would say, it's culture. Then the woman would say, the women, not us that live there, but is a culture to have that cell phone. So culture is static when it's convenient, but it moves when it's also convenient, and the women challenge this. So culture is yes, one needs to respect culture, but it's also a convenient discourse when there's power involved. And women were saying, no, this is not how it should be. So I also went into these communities when we had to assess, do we build them a road? Because it's deep rural, whatever. So the engineers on the board would say, yes, we have to build a road, they need a road. I would say, let's talk to the women and the participants, and do they really need a road? And the women would say, no, we don't need a road. Who's going to ride over those roads? We don't have cars. Build us a bridge, a footpath that I can take my child to the taxi, to the school, or to the clinic, because even at that stage, South Africa, we're really good in that way. We were building clinics in these deep rural areas. So one also needs to listen to Indigenous knowledge when we're doing inclusive spaces. So I've taken the liberty here to talk about inclusive spaces, and not only inclusive city centers or cities. But for me, I've used the word city broadly. Some of these challenges we pick up in the cities as well. A gendered nature of transport in wherever women travel. So we can look at travel patterns. Women are more likely to experience gender-based violence on public transportation, concerns about safety, women's mobility, and the ability to use public transport independently. So let's bring it back to the inclusive city. If we have these challenges, we do not have a vibrant and inclusive city. The women and men have different travel patterns and needs, as I've said. Women often take more frequent, shorter trips, and they combine work and care responsibilities. So men just go to work and they go home, or maybe the middle class men play golf, and the other men go to the pub, or I'm generalizing, but that's the dominant research. Women also have to take issues of care. They have to go and fetch their older mom and take her to the hospital, or their children to the clinic or to the doctor, or whatever the case is. So there's more direct linear patterns for travel for men and women, and that also impacts on transport planning. Most transport infrastructure and services are designed for commuters who travel directly from home to the CBD. I've spoken about that. And the transport workforce is also highly gendered. It's getting better in South Africa, where more women are represented, but of course, there are still some challenges. Improving gender equity in transport for inclusive cities. So some ways to improve gender equity in transport include integrating gender-related data into service planning. There is data paucity as well. Improving security at stops and terminals. We in very different spaces. I don't want to be Africa-phobic, but I'm just being realistic in terms of the gender challenges. Installing better lighting in waiting areas where women wait when they fetch their kids from school. Posting security staff, including female security officers, at crucial points. What we have found is that there's even a challenge with male security officers. I've even had an experience at a university where they are part of the perpetrators. Providing access to secure toilets for women at stations at terminals. This might seem sort of basic here in a country like this, but sometimes it's not that we don't also always in certain places have it's not only the not having the political willpower, but it's also issues, of course, of funding. And like women security officers would say, I'm now a security officer, but I can't stand here the whole day. I need to go and fetch my children. So, one needs to think about that. And installing emergency panic buttons on buses and trains. Educating train and station staff how to respond to incidents of sexual harassment. This is all the kinds of planning that we needed to do, and policy that we need to write, and interventions that we need to do if we are clear about an inclusive city for all. So that is my take on gender and transport in the city. Why the importance does this matter? So the lack of adequate transport for girls, they don't go to school. They're absent from school. In the city, anyway. Women limit themselves to job opportunities closer to home. That's a World Bank report. Okay, and then even they can't go out and look for work because there's transport challenges. At universities where I've been, and as many times women students come to me and say, "Why are you late?" And then they say, "Transport, ma'am. Transport, ma'am." Full equality with men in choosing using transport would have more control of their life choices. This is also the World Bank. Enhancing women's mobility in cities could have a transformative impact on the global and local economy through increased labor force participation. So the conference that we also did many years ago, we had some support from global funders like banks. Adequate transport in cities and rural areas, access to healthcare. Women are having a heart attack. There's no transport. They're dead. Their girl children, their boy children, their husbands are sick. You die because there's no transport. Yet there's a clinic, but there's no transport, or they didn't have that footbridge, or it was flooding. The issue of climate change, gender and transport is also so important. I was thinking of, adding information on gender, transport, and climate change, but I then thought, Sam's speech yesterday's keynote spoke to it, and one just needs to engage more with those areas. Gender, so that's my issue on transport and an inclusive city. I'm now going to move to gender and inclusive cities, including the LGBTQI population. So Amartya Sen talks about missing women. I want to talk about missing citizens of the LGBTQI plus community in Africa. South Africa, my country, is the only country on the continent where the Constitution prohibits discrimination against the LGBTQI plus community. It's criminalized, as I've been saying, since I got here on Monday, and I was at the stage feeling that maybe I must talk less about the issue, but one's voice should not be muted by oneself. Criminalized across many countries. And I've used Uganda here as just an example. So the majority of countries in Africa have policies which are anti-human rights and anti the international court in terms of, or international law, when it comes to the LGBTQI community. It's got worse, not better. My PhD looked at Black South African lesbians' discourse of invisible lives. So I can tell you that homosexuality has been institutionalized across Africa for forever. It was the colonialists that, when they brought particular religion and wanted to control sexuality for their benefits, that started to outlaw and criminalize acts of same, let's call it, for want of a better way, same gender engagement. So in 2023, Uganda passed one of the world's harshest anti-gay laws. It includes life in prison for anybody convicted of homosexuality. And the president signed the Anti-Homosexuality Act. It was challenged by activists. I mean, there's many activists in the country. But in April 2024, the Ugandan Constitutional Court upheld most of the provisions in the Anti-Homosexuality Act, including death penalty in certain circumstances. And after the law in 2023, there were break-ins at NGOs that were supportive of human rights and supportive of gender and the LGBTQI plus community. There were mass arrests at Pride events, and also, of course, LGBTQI community are poorer, they have health issues, access to health, and there were raids at homeless shelters. I can give you examples in Tanzania, Zimbabwe, but Ghana is another country that has, in the past few years, it's maybe in the last 36 months, also passed laws that are very, very anti-human rights framework. There has been little outcries from the international community and from donors and from Western governments, but it has not been enough. SGD and the LGBTQI community. So we have an SDG on gender, on education, you know, the SDGs. I'm of the opinion there was lobbying when I think in 2015, when they were writing the SDGs from the LGBTQI plus community, there was lobbying so that LGBTQI be a specific SDG like gender equality or any of the other SDGs, but it didn't happen. So they could have gone further and explicitly called for LGBTIQ equality. We can't have vibrant and inclusive cities if we don't have a large percentage of our population on non-citizens. LGBTQ has been at the receiving end and left behind by international development initiatives. Not all, but there has been marginalization. Of course, there's discriminatory laws, there's stigma, poor access to health. It doesn't stay at the level of you prosecuted. It has consequences for your life. And also bullying against LGBTQI plus youth. I think, and there's some research that's done, and there's also anecdotal experience that some of the suicides that we've had in South Africa in recent years is gay and lesbian youth. And we have a good policy framework, but they excluded, and people are excluded from the city, not only by policy, but also by attitudes. So is policy enough? So I grew up and I spent a lot of time in a city that used to be called Port Elizabeth. It's now called Gqeberha, and it's in the Nelson Mandela metropole. So is policy enough? No, policy is not enough. So on the 14th of October, I was at home and visiting my mom, and I was in Nelson Mandela Bay, and this was the headlines: brutal murders, Rock Bay gay community. I tried to put it there. I brought it to you. I think there's been 5 or 6 murders of gay people in the Bay in the last 3 months. You can read it. Policy, we need policy at the beginning, but we need more than policy. In South Africa, the law protects many, but there's many gay murders. And very often they talk about hate crimes, and the word homophobic murders are left out. The discourse in the media is watered down. Context and environment. How do we sort this out? What could we do? There's nothing so that I'm saying major that nobody else has said previously. This is gender-based violence and homophobic violence that we're talking about. There needs to be international pressure. My country has been great in going to the International Court of Justice to support the Palestine cause, because that's genocide, and they've been great. We need that level of pressure, because these are people that are being murdered. We know about 5, there are many across the continent. The role of civil society. Now, across Africa, years ago, and also in South Africa, we used to have vibrant civil society movements. And I think because of the economy, where we are politically, the global forces, what we're having to focus on, the role of civil society has dwindled. So it needs to come from below, but I think we as scholars, intellectuals, need to also ask ourselves, what role do we do? How does our research impact on what we are doing? Because theory without practice, as Lenin said, is a lie and a hypocrisy. There needs to be partnerships with government, with policymakers, with allies. And we need to hold, and I liked your input yesterday, we need to hold governments accountable. And then the person that sat on the panel with me when I spoke about the issue of homophobia in sport, she spoke about the issue of curriculum. And I think we need to teach and train people differently. We can't only just have the blame game. We need to change mindsets. If we don't liberate our minds, that's the first big challenge. So these policies, practices is linked to patriarchy. Okay? Policies are beginning and necessary. It's implemented and driven at all levels, and it should be. How do people implement and teach what they do not know? So I think one also, when it comes to transport planning, the LGBTQI+, it's challenges in building vibrant communities and cities, we need to involve local people. Local histories need to be shared, and because we need to also understand and make communities understand that this was not always like this, undiscourse the discourse that has been entrenched for a number of generations. We need to use human rights arguments to change people's attitudes. And then faith-based organizations, for example, Bishop Tutu, the Nobel Prize winner from South Africa, he was very clear that homosexuality is not anti-Christianity. And I can go into that in detail. I think we can talk about that. So as people use the Bible, the Afrikaners use the Bible to entrench apartheid, the Bible and the Quran is used to entrench anti-human rights arguments, whether it's against the aged, disability, gender, LGBTQI communities, and curriculum, like I said, needs to look at. When I say curriculum, I'm looking throughout the education sector. Facing the facts, gender equality is a development issue. It's a health issue. It's a human rights issue. Now I'm sounding like a politician, but it's essential to achieving peaceful societies and sustainable development. That I have no doubt about. The research shows all of that. A Fanonian vision of the city. So there's an architect, Joseph Farage, he's a sort of very progressive architect, I'm assuming. In 2007, he said, what is an African architecture? And I read it, what is an inclusive African city? So the answer that he gave, the first objective of African architecture, and I again read, the first objective of the African city should be to contribute decisively to the improvement of life and habitation. And this was taken from Fanonian Practice, a book by Nigel Gibson. So I want to say, I share this. I cannot contest that in any way, that if we're talking about an African city that's inclusive, it has to contribute decisively to the improvement of life and living on what they call habitation. An inclusive African city, in other words, simply put, the African city should be produced socially by the people who live in it. And I've quoted Gibson from his book, Fanonian Practices in South Africa, and I thank you.